Hello and welcome to Rural Texas on RFD. Last time on our show we took you to South America and China as part of the Texas Farm Bureau's Global Agricultural Education Tours for 2006. Now, the third and final leg of those tours for this year, the trip to Canada, has been completed. I was fortunate enough to go along on those trips, and I shot the video and interviews you'll be seeing just a little bit later on. We'll be talking in just a moment with a member of the Texas Farm Bureau staff who organized that trip to Canada. Also, we'll be taking a look at Texas' brand new tuberculosis-free status for the cattle industry. And we'll look again at the devastating drought that has crippled Texas agriculture for much of this year. More on Rural Texas right after this.
Are you a Texan? Are you a farmer or rancher? Is Texas agriculture important to you? Do you care about the future of rural Texas? Perhaps you're concerned about property rights, stewardship of the land, and the next generation of farm and ranch families. If any of this describes your thinking, then you belong in the Texas Farm Bureau. Make your voice heard in the organization that is the voice of Texas agriculture. Call your County Farm Bureau office or visit us on the web at www.txfb.org.
Okay, we're back on Rural Texas, and with me now is Cy Cook of the Texas Farm Bureau staff. Hello, Cy. You organized the trips to Canada, and you went along with some other members of the Farm Bureau staff, and we had, tell us a little bit about who was on the trip.
We had several members of our state board of directors on what we call a global education trip. We had two members of our commodity advisory committees, both the forestry and the wheat chairman, and then we had 4 staff members as well for staff support.
What did we learn in Canada? Well, first, why did we go?
I think everybody needs to realize that we now live in a global economy. It's very important for us, and especially agricultural organizations, to understand the rest of the world. It's very apparent if you travel around the world that most countries and most nationalities know far more about us in the United States than we do about them. We absolutely have to export our agricultural production here in the U.S., so it's important that we understand the cultures and governments of other countries.
Well, what did we learn in Canada?
Well, I think the whole basis of the trip was set when we met with the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Wilkins, in Ottawa.
Not everyone gets to do that, do they?
That is a very rare privilege, and our group was fortunate enough to be able to meet with him, and he immediately impressed upon us his gratitude for the group being in Canada and learning and showing a willingness to learn about the Canadians.
Unfortunately, we do not have video of the ambassador and our meeting with him because of security concerns, but we do have a few thoughts on the trip from Texas Farm Bureau Vice President Lloyd Arthur.
It's been an informable trip, Gene. It's been from one side or the other. We've had real good attendance in our meetings, people with good knowledge and background giving us some information, and I think it's been a tremendous educational benefit for us in Texas Farm Bureau.
Okay, Cy, getting into the specifics just a little bit, Canada is very much like the United States. In fact, probably the group that went to South America and went to China, they experienced a little culture shock, maybe some language barriers. We really didn't have any of that, did we?
No, the Canadian trip was, from a logistics standpoint, very easy to arrange. The first thing is you find when you want to visit Canada, especially from an agricultural standpoint, the Canadians want you to come. It's easy to get into Canada, and they're very forthcoming. They want you to come. They want to show you their country. You don't have the culture shock. You don't have the language barrier. You don't have the monetary problems. The Canadian dollar is worth about 90 cents on the U.S. dollar, but other than a conversion rate, you don't have those worries.
Canada has a farm program, and that's something that intrigued some of our people that were on the trip. But basically, the Canadian farm program is kind of a revenue assurance program that works differently than ours does.
It does. They took care to make sure that it complies with all the WTO rules. And the Canadian farm program basically is a combination of risk management, risk mitigation, and insurance. It has some of the same problems that ours does. It's basically a farmer takes his average income for 5 years. They remove the high year and the low year and take the average, and then if his revenues fall below that average, then he gets paid.
And all crops, including livestock, are in this one, right?
Yes, they are.
That is something that's very different than what we do here in the States. Now, the dairy program drew a lot of interest. Number one, it seems to return a lot more dollars to the producers, but go into that just a little bit. How does that program work?
They have a quota system in Canada that we don't have here. There's a set number of dairy cows or quota that can be had, and it's quite expensive to get into the business. The quota for one dairy cow is approximately $24,000 to $30,000. That's a substantial investment.
Just for the right to produce milk?
Just for the right to produce milk. It basically takes about 10 years to pay for that quota. Once a quota is established and a producer has that quota, they typically use that as their retirement, or they pass that quota along to members of the family to ensure that they can produce dairy products in the future.
And for a few thoughts on the dairy system in Canada, we had a dairyman along on the trip, Don Smith of Sulphur Springs, on our state board of directors. Let's hear what Don had to say.
Well, it's quite a bit different than my dairy in Texas. Of course, we have a grazing operation in Texas. This is a completely confined operation. Mr. Scouton told us this afternoon that when his heifers were weaned and moved into the barn, they spent the rest of their lives inside of a barn. Of course, the winters here are very extreme. They have to be for that reason, but he hauls all the feed to them. He's feeding a silage and haylage ration right now. A very impressive kind of operation.
One of the main reasons, Si, that we went to Canada was to take a look at the cattle identification system that they have there. What have they done right? What have we done wrong? Or what was the situation with that?
Well, I was impressed, as I think the other members of our group were, with the Canadian Animal ID system. They have established their system, and it's been operating since 2002. They chose to identify individual animals, and they chose to restrict it to one species. They only do cattle at this point. It's a private agency, which I think we want to follow here in the United States, and it is governed by a board of directors that represents every segment of the Canadian cattle industry. Feeders, dairymen, stocker buyers, every segment of the industry. And also they have two ex officio members, one from Canada Agriculture and Food, which is about like USDA here, and then the Canada Food Inspection Agency.
But they went slow, and there's no premise ID, so there were some fundamental differences.
Absolutely. They took baby steps. They went very slowly. They do have premise ID on the horizon. They can age verify at this point. They are in the process of being able to verify movement of livestock, but they will again take all of those areas very slowly.
We have a lot to talk about, but the rancher's beef operation, the brand new slaughter facility we saw there, it kind of employs some of that cattle ID technology, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They can track a cattle all the way through the process, even the slaughter process.
Okay, in Ottawa, we visited with the folks at the Iogen Corporation. That's a very exciting technology those guys are developing over there, right? Cellulosic ethanol.
Absolutely. We tend to concentrate on corn, ethanol, that type of thing here in the United States. They're concentrating, though, on making ethanol out of waste products, products that normally have no significant economic value.
Some thoughts on the cellulosic ethanol at Iogen from Billy Bob Brown.
We visited with Iogen, a plant that they're developing enzymes for ethanol with cellulose. Was extremely interesting and probably has a very bright future.
Si, the Canadian Wheat Board is something all of us have heard about for a long time, but it was really interesting to get an up-close personal look at it.
Pretty well all of the wheat that is not feed wheat in Canada is marketed through the Canadian Wheat Board by law. The reason they do this, it gives them a single desk approach to grain marketing. They can have a very, very large shipment of grain and negotiate with their producers in that manner.
And our wheat chairman for Texas Farm Bureau, Tommy Henderson, was along on the trip, and he allowed us, this was interesting, but he's not sure he wants to try it.
I don't really think that's something I would like to pursue. I still believe more in individual marketing. The one advantage that they do have is where they can put so much together for export, but it takes out the individual ability to market as he sees fit.
Okay, moving alongside, kind of sum up the trip for us. Where did it begin? Where did it end? We've talked about some of the important issues and things we saw, but how did all that play out?
Well, once again, it was important that we understand our greatest trading partner. In summary, Canada is the United States' greatest trading partner. We enjoy the largest bilateral trading relationship of any two countries in the world. Canada is our #1 energy producer. We tend to think a lot about the Middle East, but Canada is our #1 energy source. There are 33 million people that live in Canada. That is just slightly smaller than the folks that live in California. But that small population is one of the biggest economic importances to us that there is worldwide.
Focusing in back on Alberta just a moment, where we saw ranchers' beef. We saw a cattle feeding operation there that was impressive, but perhaps somewhat smaller than what we're used to here in Texas.
Cattleland feed yards had a capacity of 25,000 head, and that is small by Texas standards. However, they implemented a high degree of technology there, and one of the most interesting things I think we all noticed there is the number of females that were working at the feedlot. There's an oil boom going on in the province of Alberta. The oil sands have really sapped the labor source there. 30% of the employees at Cattleland were ladies, and they were doing a fabulous job. I think that impressed our group.
Okay, and Larry Pratt was very impressed with the beef technology and the good beef that we ate while we were in Canada. Let's hear from Larry for just a moment.
We've seen some very good cattle, and the beef that we've eaten in the restaurants and the processed beef has been excellent. And we saw a feedlot today that had a great number of very good-looking cattle, as good as you could grow anywhere, and we've been very well impressed with the quality of those cattle.
Let's address this quickly, Si, but a big dispute is on the verge of resolution, the Softwood lumber dispute. Just in a nutshell, what's that all about?
Well, basically, we can buy Canadian softwood products here in the U.S., in specifically East Texas, more cheaply than lumber that is produced in the same county that is sold in. A lot of the forestry regions in Canada are owned by the Crown, so producers can acquire that lumber at what is seen at substantially cheaper rates than we can here in the U.S.
And our forestry chairman for the Texas Farm Bureau, James Dawson of Nacogdoches County, was along on the trip. Here's his thoughts on that dispute.
It's a little bit hard for me to understand how anybody can purchase a tree at what I would call a market price, mill it and ship it 3,000 miles and still sell it cheaper than we can sell in a store that's being manufactured in the same county in Texas.
Okay, and in summary, Si, the trip to Canada, was it worth it?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime that you can learn about any other culture, any other country, it's well worth your while. But in this situation, having such a close relationship in both trade and geography, it's extremely important that we know all about our neighbor to the north.
Thank you very much, Si. We appreciate you being here. In just a moment, we're going to take a look at Texas' brand new tuberculosis-free status in our cattle industry, a red letter day. Back in just a moment.
Agriculture is Texas' renewable industry, not only growing food and fiber for Texas families, but creating 1 in 5 Texas jobs. I'm Mike Barnett, editor of Texas Agriculture. In our publication, you'll read profiles of the trendsetters of agriculture in the Lone Star State. We'll bring you profiles of farmers and ranchers surviving and thriving on the land and the issues shaping the future of rural Texas. Read all about it in Texas Agriculture, an exclusive benefit of your Texas Farm Bureau membership.
Welcome back to rural Texas. The recent news that Texas is now free of cattle tuberculosis comes after 4 years of a partnership to eliminate the disease from the state's beef and dairy herds. Our senior reporter, Tom Nicoletti, has that story.
When the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced that Texas has regained cattle tuberculosis-free status, a monumental effort had paid off. Since September 2003, more than 335,000 cows in all of the state's 818 dairies and nearly 129,000 beef cattle in more than 2,000 of the state's seed stock or purebred herds were tested for cattle TB, costing millions of dollars. Ranchers, private veterinary practitioners, and state and federal animal health personnel all played a role in the team effort to eradicate cattle TB. The Texas Animal Health Commission was one of those agencies involved in the process.
Free status means that, according to USDA rules, that we can ship our cattle to other states without a federal requirement for testing those cattle. So we can gain the ability to move interstate without increased cost. That's one factor. We can provide a greater level of assurance to our producers who are buying replacement cattle from their neighbors or from other producers in the state that the cattle they're buying are free of TB. So that's a huge benefit to us.
For cattle owners involved in regional and statewide stock shows and fairs, the benefit of TB-free status is immediate. Cattle transported to events in Texas do not require a TB test. Although USDA would not impose tests for movement in interstate commerce, individual states do have the authority to require something more than USDA. At least for the short term, states could require tests of Texas breeding cattle to other states. Additionally, other countries may require TB tests of Texas cattle moving in international shipments, even though Texas is TB-free. That's because the United States is not a TB-free nation. As part of the overall partnership in testing cattle, West Texas rancher Pete Case voluntarily had his entire herd tested for TB. The herd came out clean with no reactors.
We had to gather all the cattle on this ranch and run them through the pen facilities here and test them and put the reactant in them first, and then follow with observing to see if the reactant, if they had a reaction. And then we had to do that 3 days later, so that meant bringing them all back in again. It needs to all be done in one day if you can do it, and so that means you need to have plenty of help on hand to get the job done, and of course that's an expense.
More than 500 veterinarians were also involved in the partnership to make Texas a TB-free state once again. The state had lost this valuable status in 2002 after 2 TB-infected cattle herds were detected.
I think it's a real accomplishment by the beef industry in Texas to get back to a free status. The cooperation of the producers to make this happen shows a lot of unity in the beef industry in Texas.
Maintaining herds free of cattle TB is now the key. Cattle producers are being urged to take precautions. Dairy producers who purchase replacement heifers should assure that the animals originate from reliable sources and have a negative TB test prior to purchase. Mexico has a serious cattle TB problem, but tremendous progress has been made in the last 10 to 15 years as Mexico developed its tuberculosis eradication program.
We import approximately 1 million head of cattle a year out of Mexico. Most of them are feeders. There are a few smaller numbers that are competition cattle, rodeos, ropings, and that sort of thing, and a really very small number of breeding stock.
Texas Farm Bureau is one of the many organizations working with USDA and Mexico to eventually eradicate TB in that country.
A review team will spend 5 days in Mexico reviewing a state, and these states must improve their incidence rate of their TB infected herds each year by a certain percentage, or they drop down in status, or in some cases some states have even lost their export status. And then we work with those states on how to correct those deficiencies so that they can continue to export to the United States.
Additional precautions include not commingling Mexican feeder cattle with Texas cattle on pastures or in grower lots, and ensuring that Mexican roping cattle or rodeo steers are held separately from Texas cattle. For Rural Texas, I'm Tom Nicoletti in Schleicher County.
Thanks, Tom. We'll be right back on Rural Texas right after this.
Decades ago, Americans started leaving the farm for other professions and pursuits. The farmers that stayed fed America and much of the world. Today we grow more food than ever, and it's better, safer, and healthier. We live in the land of plenty, thanks to modern agricultural technology and the skills of our farm and ranch families. This message is brought to you by the Texas Farm Bureau, the voice of Texas agriculture. Today's abundance of food and fiber is brought to you by America's farmers and ranchers.
The crippling drought of 2006 is now on record as the most damaging in our state's history. Farm and ranch families all over this state have been exceptionally hard hit. Tom Nicoletti visited North Texas, an area that traditionally gets more rainfall than most other parts of Texas. But this year has been a tough one. Here's Tom's story.
According to figures released by Texas A&M University, the dry conditions throughout most of the state for much of 2006 have resulted in the most damaging drought ever in the Lone Star State. With a few weeks remaining in the year, damage to Texas agriculture has surpassed $4 billion, which is nearly double the previous record in 1996. By Texas A&M's estimate, crop damage this year was $2.5 billion, while livestock losses stood at more than $1.6 billion. Damage to rural communities could approach $8 billion. Fannin County, like many other counties in North and East Texas, has received about 23 inches of rainfall in 2006. Normally, about 38 inches of precipitation falls in this part of the state on an annual basis. But the drought began well before this year.
2005 and 2006 is probably the worst drought since the Dust Bowl in the 30s.
David Hembry is a cattle and hay producer. He says every farmer's crops failed in this county in 2006.
I'm 61 years old and I've never seen a year where all the farmers failed on their crops. Now this year everybody failed on their row crops. The hay has just been a dismal failure. We're in a situation where we even baled the corn crop for hay. We've baled the milo crops for hay, we've baled soybeans for hay. That's all it was good for.
Hay and water are in very short supply because of the extremely dry conditions. The number of hay cuttings has been reduced this year, while pastures have very little grass growth at all despite late-season rains.
Well, in a normal year right here on this particular place, we would cut most of our hay meadows a minimum of 2 times, and some meadows we would actually cut 3 times. This year we're going to get 1 cutting of hay. That's all we're going to get, and we're standing here in my stack yard right now, and there's 206 rows of hay. And in this stack yard at this time of year we ought to be completely through with all of our hay harvest, and there ought to be at least 1,000 rows of hay here. This lake we're looking at right now covers about 1.5 acres of water. Under normal conditions this lake would be about a 10-acre lake. And all this vegetation around the side that you are looking at, it would normally be covered in water. And there's 2 or 3 fence lines that you can see now that would normally be out in the lake and be underwater. So that's an indication of the severity of our water shortage problem.
The result? Producers have to sell their cattle earlier than normal. At Cattleman's Sale Barn in the Lamar County town of Paris, cattle sales were brisk all summer into the autumn months.
We've running a lot more cattle the same period as we did last year, and probably between 25 and 30,000 head above the same year-to-date of last year.
The impact of the prolonged drought in Texas goes well beyond the fence lines of farms and ranches. Here in downtown Bonham, an economic trickle-down effect can be felt at local businesses.
For instance, local feed store business has slowed considerably since the drought.
My feed sales are off probably 30–40% over the last year and a half, 2 years. We're in a 2-year drought, and it's just gotten worse this year.
Livestock, more so than crop producers, are going out of business due to the extended drought. The impact is evident at Fannin Bank in Bonham. The bank's executive vice president explains the effect on agricultural loans.
Anyone who has had any reserves at all in the last 2 years, they have been depleted. And then, of course, this last year we allowed quite a few of our borrowers to not make any or nominal or minimal principal reductions. You know, everyone was able to pay their interest, but we allowed them to, to make just minimal principal reductions on their loans, and even allowed some operating lines to not clear out. That same thing is going to have to happen again this year. What it has really done is caused a lot of our producers to have to liquidate assets to pay debt because they can't afford the interest on it.
Advice to farmers and ranchers weathering the drought is to keep their bankers informed because lending institutions are working with producers any way they can to develop a plan to get agricultural producers through the worst drought in Texas history. For Rural Texas, I'm Tom Nicoletti in Bonham.
Thanks for joining us today for our look at Canada, our neighbors to the north, part of the Texas Farm Bureau's Global Agricultural Education Tours. On Rural Texas, we examine the stories of Texas agriculture and the farm and ranch families on the land of this great state. Join us next time for Rural Texas, right here on RFD.